Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're digging into a bit of a medical device puzzle. It's about Philips and their Tack Endovascular System.
Right. The one they acquired seemed pretty strategic at the time, but then pulled off the market just, what, 5 years later?
Exactly. And the reason given was customer challenges. So our mission today is really to try and unpack that. Where did things go wrong, especially for you folks in quality, regulatory, risk? What are the lessons here?
And we've got some decent material to work with. FDA summaries on safety and effectiveness for the different tax systems, the 6F and the 4F.
Clinical trial data too, right? TOBA2 and 2BA2 BTK.
Yep, those are key. Plus Philips' own press releases from the time, which sound quite optimistic, actually. And we even have some anatomical studies on lower limb arteries, which might give us some context.
Okay, so it sets up a real mystery. A major player like Philips makes a big move, the initial data looks promising, and then suddenly, problems. Real-world problems. Let's start at the beginning. What was the tax system actually for?
Basically, it was designed to fix a specific problem that can happen during angioplasty in the leg's PTA, percutaneous transluminal angioplasty. Sometimes the procedure itself can cause tears, dissections, in the artery lining.
Okay, then those tears are bad news.
They can be, yeah. They disrupt blood flow. And that's particularly risky for patients who already have compromised circulation. Think critical limb ischemia, diabetes, bad atherosclerosis. Fixing those dissections is pretty important.
And the tax system had different versions for different arteries, I gather.
That's right. There was the 6F system, that was for the bigger arteries, the superficial femoral and the proximal popliteal, sort of thigh and upper calf area.
Right.
Then there was the 4F system. That was for the smaller arteries, further down, mid to distal, popliteal, tibial, peroneal arteries. We're talking diameters from like 1.5 up to 4.5 millimeters. These are the ones feeding the foot directly.
And those smaller arteries, they can be tricky anatomically speaking. I remember seeing something about variability.
Oh, absolutely. That study on the posterior tibial artery, it found significant variations, minor or major, in how it branches in, well, over half the population, 56%.
Wow, over half.
Yeah. And you have to wonder, right? How much did that real-world anatomical variability, especially in those tiny below-the-knee vessels, play into the customer challenges later on? Even if the vessel diameter fit the specs, maybe the twists and turns, the branching patterns, maybe they made deployment harder than in the trials.
That's a really interesting point, something that might not show up easily in standard testing. Speaking of testing, the initial bench tests and biocompatibility, those all looked okay.
They did, according to the FDA summaries, yeah. Both the 6F and 4F systems went through a whole battery of tests. Material checks, shape memory crucial for nitinol implants, corrosion resistance.
No issues with rust or anything like that?
Nope. Looked good against fretting, pitting, galvanic corrosion. Dimensions held up after deployment. The radial force was there. Mechanical properties, stress strain, fatigue analysis, all met the safety factors.
And they even simulated long-term use.
For the 6F, yes. They did accelerated durability testing, simulating 10 years in vitro. Passed that too. Crush resistance was good. Delivery systems worked. You could see them okay on imaging. So mechanically, they seemed sound.
What about how the body would react? Biocompatibility?
Also generally favorable results. They tested for everything you'd expect: cytotoxicity, sensitization, irritation, systemic toxicity, pyrogenicity, genotoxicity, hemocompatibility. The implant itself is permanent contact with blood. The delivery system limited contact. No major red flags raised there in the preclinical phase.
Okay. So good on the bench, good biocompatibility profile. Then come the human trials. Let's talk 2BA3 first, the 6F system and the bigger arteries.
Right. 2BA2 enrolled 213 patients, U.S. and Austria. All had post-PTA dissections in the SFA or proximal popliteal. The main safety check was at 30 days, looking for major adverse events, MAEs, like amputation, needing another procedure in the same spot, or death.
And how did that turn out?
Met the goal easily. In fact, 0 MAEs reported in those first 30 days.
0. That's impressive.
It is. And then effectiveness, looking at 12-month patency, basically, keeping the artery open without needing reintervention or developing significant narrowing.
How'd that look?
Also met its performance goal. They achieved 65.6% patency, which was better than the target they'd set. Plus, very low rates of other complications like embolization or the tacks moving, and importantly, no tack fractures seen at 12 months.
Okay. No, you mentioned a nuance there. Something about drug-coated balloons.
Yes. There was an observation, not a primary finding, but an observation that outcomes might have been slightly less good in patients who had a drug-coated balloon angioplasty before the tack placement compared to just a plain balloon.
Interesting. Why would that be?
Well, the study authors themselves pointed out it wasn't randomized, so the groups might have been different to start with. It wasn't conclusive, more something noted.
Got it. Okay, let's shift gears to the other trial, TOBA TPTK. This used the smaller 4F system below the knee in patients with more severe disease, right?
Exactly. These were 233 patients with critical limb ischemia, Rutherford class 4 or 5. So rest pain or some minor tissue loss. Their wounds and infection levels were relatively controlled, though, based on the WIFI grading, a challenging group.
And the results for this tougher scenario?
Again, surprisingly positive based on the trial report. Primary safety at 30 days, that composite of major adverse limb events plus perioperative death, or MALE plus POD, was only 4.7%, well below the performance goal threshold.
And effectiveness, keeping limbs safe and functional.
Primary effectiveness, which was freedom from that MALE plus POD endpoint out to 6 months, also met its goal significantly, hitting 95.6%.
95% free from major issues at 6 months in CLI patients. That does sound very good.
It really does. And other measures backed it up. At 6 months, the actual tack segment state open patency was 82.1%. Limb salvage rate was incredibly high at 98.5%. And even looking out further, a later analysis at 12 months showed no embolizations, no migrations, no fractures. Plus, significant improvements in patient symptoms, their Rutherford class, and blood flow measures like ABT-BI at both 6 and 12 months.
Okay, so let me recap. 2 big trials, different artery sizes, different patient groups, both reporting positive safety and effectiveness. Philips issues press releases highlighting this, talking about sustained effects, quality of life improvements.
Right, emphasizing the dissection repair aspect.
And yet, 5 years after the acquisition, they pull it, citing customer challenges during use. This is the core of the mystery, isn't it? This huge disconnect.
It absolutely is. You have what looks like solid clinical evidence generated in controlled trial settings, likely by very experienced operators. But then, when the device gets out into the wider world, used by a broader range of doctors, potentially more varied and complex situations, something wasn't working well enough.
And the frustrating part is, our sources don't spell out exactly what those customer challenges were. Was it deployment difficulty, device handling, unexpected interactions with anatomy?
We're left to infer, largely. But that inference process is crucial for the lessons learned. So for you listening, especially if you're in QA, RA, or risk management, what can we take away from this situation?
Lesson 1 seems pretty clear. Bench tests and clinical trials, even well-run ones, aren't the whole story. They might not catch everything about real-world usability.
Precisely. That anatomical variability we talked about, the range of physician skill and experience, different hospital settings. These factors can introduce challenges that just don't surface in a controlled trial. You have to ask, did the pre-market testing adequately simulate the full spectrum of use?
Which leads straight to the importance of post-market surveillance, right? Vigilance after launch.
Absolutely critical. You need robust systems to continuously monitor real-world performance. Crack adverse events diligently, yes, but also actively solicit and analyze user feedback. This is where you pick up signals, maybe subtle at first, that weren't apparent before. Perhaps users were reporting difficulty deploying the tack in certain types of lesions, or maybe seeing minor migrations more often than the trial suggested.
The phrase customer challenges during use just screams usability and human factors to me. Maybe the device was fiddly, maybe the learning curve was steeper than expected, maybe it didn't play well with certain common anatomical quirks, despite being technically within the size range.
All plausible scenarios. And good usability testing, early and with a diverse range of actual potential users, might have flagged some of these potential issues before it got to market. It's not just about whether the device can work, but whether it can work reliably and intuitively in typical hands, under typical pressures.
And that feeds directly into risk management. A good risk plan needs to anticipate these kinds of usability or real-world performance issues, and, crucially, have mechanisms to detect them early via post-market data and then act on them.
Right. The fact that Philips discontinued it suggests the issues, whatever they were specifically, were deemed significant enough that the risk-benefit balance shifted negatively. Maybe the problems were too frequent, or the potential harm too severe, or perhaps simply too difficult to mitigate through training or labeling alone.
It also puts a spotlight on due diligence during acquisitions if you're buying a company and its technology.
You need to look beyond just the published trial data and the regulatory filings. You have to really kick the tires on real-world usability, understand the potential for user error, and assess how robust their post-market surveillance system actually is. Did Philips fully appreciate the potential usability challenges when they acquired Intact Vascular and the Tack system? It's a fair question.
It really is. So you have this contrast. Objective trial data looking good. Subjective user experience apparently problematic enough to halt sales. It's a stark reminder about the journey of medical technology.
Yeah, it's not just about getting the science right in the lab or even in the trial. It's about making it work consistently, safely, effectively in the messy reality of clinical practice.
So the puzzle remains somewhat unsolved in its specifics, but the lessons are potent. How could a device backed by positive trials face such significant real-world challenges? It tells us the path doesn't end at approval, that real-world use, constant surveillance, proactive risk management, these are absolutely essential.
They are paramount for long-term success and, most importantly, for patient safety.
Which brings us to a final thought for you to consider. Are there blind spots in our current quality and regulatory processes? Could we be missing something that allows this kind of gap between controlled studies and real-world experience to open up?
And maybe more importantly, how can we, as professionals in this field, work to close that gap? How do we ensure that the devices we develop, approve, and monitor are not only safe and effective on paper, but truly usable and beneficial for every patient every time in the real world?
That's the ongoing challenge, something to definitely reflect on in your own practices. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.